This young man was born in Aberdeen, Mississippi, the same week of the same year my father was born, coincidentally. In 1987, when this young man was 40, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison as the first man in the U.S. to be convicted of terrorism and is still in prison today. In between those bookends, Jeff Fort took control of one of Chicago's most infamous street organizations and changed its name to one that denoted peace, prosperity, people, and power. That group, the Blackstone Nation, then spread out across the country, even to Los Angeles. Then Jeff Fort changed his name to Prince Imam Malik and changed the name of his organization to Rukn, an Arabic name. But first, let's go back. Jeff Fort, reputed leader of the Rukn street gang, adjusts his distinctive headgear as a companion tries to ward off a photographer at traffic court in Chicago. Fort, accompanied by about 20 of his generals, appeared on charges stemming from a high-speed chase, which ended in the arrest of the longtime street gang figure. I was reading a 1988 story from the Chicago Tribune, and I came across a long article with many people, mostly Chicago PD interviewed, but some family also, about the enigmatic and powerful figure Jeff Fort. Quote, Jeff Fort is directly or indirectly responsible for 500 to 1,000 murders, a detective named Kolovitz flatly states, though he knows that Fort had never been convicted for a single murder at the time. And what is indirectly responsible? I mean, we're all indirectly responsible for all sorts of things. You don't go to jail for being indirectly responsible. Now, as the article went on, there were quotes like, nearly every cop who has worked the South Side boasts of arresting Fort or beating the hell out of him. Outrageous stories like Fort jumping on his victims from trees. You'll hear that he patterned himself after Hitler, threatened to kill Jesse Jackson, and made serial killer Richard Speck his main squeeze in prison. Most of these stories are unprovable, the cop Kolovich concedes, like the murder estimate. The interview was conducted at a bar, which is simply the white man's dope spot or trap in the modern parlance, and once the Chi-Town 12 was liquored up, he had lots of stories for the intrepid reporter about Jeff Fort. Once, he recalled, they raided an Rukn-owned apartment building in the middle of the night. In the confusion, several Rukns rushed down the hall and pinned his partner in a corner, guns cocked pointed at his head. Luckily, Kolovitz said Jeff Fort was running down the hallway to see what the commotion was in his underwear, and Detective Kolovitz was able to grab Fort, let him tell his Rukn cronies, let my guy go or yours is gone. While Jeff Fort was locked up and forgotten about over 30 years ago at this point, he was once seen as a real political force in Chicago, all the way up to President Nixon's White House even, who invited him to the 1969 Republican inauguration.
And there's not going to be no killing without killing, gentlemen, with all due respect.
Now, Fort's potential for good or bad was once hotly debated, but by 1970, his detractors had won. Since then, the story has been told almost exclusively by police and prosecutors. Law enforcement spent millions to destroy his group and imprison him forever, which they've effectively done. In 1988, Cook County charged Fort with ordering the hit of a reputed dope dealer named Willie Bibbs. And the Rukns were also tangled in an alleged, well, not alleged now, they were found guilty of being involved in a murder for hire scheme involving Noah Robinson, who was Jesse Jackson's half-brother. Noah Robinson had a chain of McDonald's on the South Side, and he was skimming money, and when the investors sent an investigator up to Chicago to check it out, bang, Rukn hitman did it. Noah Robinson got life no parole for ordering the hit. He's still in prison, and he's Jesse Jackson's half-brother. Now, for me, someone who reads a lot about all these different stories, it's funny, but it's not. You know, you read, like in Chicago, you read the gangster disciple indictment. All crime on the South Side of Chicago has its hands in the GDs. But if you read the Blackstone Rukn indictment, then all the crime on the South Side can be traced to them. And yet they were rivals. So how does that work? Backtracking, Jeff Fort's family was on the path of the American dream like a lot of black families in the 50s, until it got derailed by the changing American economic and political landscape. The Forts migrated to Chicago in 1955. His father, John Lee, went to work for U.S. Steel, one of the biggest companies in the world at the time. Things were going well, but then urban renewal came, ripped up their neighborhood at 22nd Street and Cottage Grove, and they relocated to Woodlawn, which had been a white neighborhood that was rapidly changing. He lived in a building called Big Red, a red brick building at 6536 South Blackstone Avenue, right near the corner where the Blackstone Rangers organization was born. He went to Scott Elementary School at 64th and Blackstone. The Forts were very attractive people, said one of Imam Malik's elementary school teachers. Political and organizational sense must have run in the family. Jeff's eyes had that brown-eyed, commanding presence that drew you in. I liked Jeff. I don't like what he did, but I liked him. Fort ended up getting sent to the Youth Correctional Center in St. Charles, Illinois, where gangs like the Vice Lords, which had been formed back in '57, the same year as the Mexican Mafia in California, coincidentally, already held sway. And then in 1962, Fort's let out, he hit the streets, and in September of '64, he's arrested as an adult for the first time for robbery. While the police labeled him a criminal, the streets gave him the nickname of Angel because he would break up fights like a cyclone. But to be a peacemaker in a violent world, you had to be violent yourself. Quote, Jeff had the reputation as someone who could kill a brick, said attorney James Montgomery. By the time he was 18, Jeff Fort was rolling through Woodlawn with an entourage. Kids on the playground would pile up along the fence just to look at him. And Fort acted as the neighborhood godfather at this young age, giving shoes to kids who needed them, finding homes for families who were evicted. I wonder, did this mean he had money or just that he could make things happen through his force of personality and mastery of human strategy? Most likely the latter. Now, the Woodlawn neighborhood is quintessential urban change. It experienced one of the most disorientingly rapid demographic changes of any area I've ever read about. The white flight phenomenon is old news, we all heard of that, but what was really shocking in Woodlawn was that the number of children, human beings under the age of 18, increased 7 times between 1958 and 1964. So imagine that you're 10 years old and you live on a block that has you and 2 other little kids. So there's 3 kids on the block when you're 10. By the time you turn 16, there's 21 kids on the block. 18 of them are new, and most of them are fresh up from Mississippi. So this is the textbook description of the places where street gangs thrive. When Chicago, the street gangs were like children's mafias, really. And Fort's unusual hold over hundreds of young boys attracted the attention of Ed Woods, a youth worker who arrived at the Woodlawn Boys Club in late '63. The newspaper article I read about this breezed through that part, but I will slow down for a second to paint a picture of what was going on in a neighborhood like Woodlawn in the years just before the riots/rebellions that marked the start of a new era of ultra-high violent crime in some cities. What were youth workers? Youth workers existed in most big cities. They are usually college students, probably white, or recent graduates or graduate students placed into high crime areas to mentor the kids. Now, looking back now, it seems pretty absurd to have people that were double, triple outsiders coming into these communities to be mentors. Even when they had the best intentions, the cultural dissonance, it's hard to even imagine today. There's an established urban culture. There's the common language of pop movies and rap and pop culture. But in the early 60s, the kids on the south side of Chicago, most of them had been born in the rural South. So the urban environment was new to them too. So how was a 22-year-old white sociology graduate student going to understand the urban environment when the people in it didn't? Because they were new to it themselves, most of them. So this Ed Woods was trying to get the gangs off the streets and in the gym, but he needed bodies, so he went to see Jeff Fort. It was around '64 or so, Woods said. I went to his house and met his mother. I told him what I wanted to do. At the time, I had 20 guys. The next day, I had 200. That's Jeff Fort in action. Anyone who saw Jeff Fort handle the little kids got the impression that he was a substitute big brother, said Dan Swope, director of the boys club at the time. Anyone who saw Jeff Fort handle the little kids got the impression that he was a big brother to them, said Dan Swope, director of the boys club at the time. He wasn't much older than the kids who admired him, but he looked to be older. There's tough kids who've seen more of life than most of us ever see. They have middle-aged eyes but young faces. Jeff was one of those kids. April 5th, 1968, Chicago's Black West Side is in flames. It's the day after Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is gunned down by escaped hillbilly petty criminal James Earl Ray in Memphis. In Woodlawn, officials at Mount Carmel High School at 64th and Dante, which I guess was mostly white, ended classes early and ordered the Chicago City buses to take the 700 white students out of the neighborhood. Without warning, a long line of Blackstone Rangers surrounded the buses. It must have been hundreds of them, and began rocking them. I thought they were going to tip them over, recalled former Scott School principal Norman Silber. But then Fort raised his arm and they stopped, did an about face, and marched right back. He controlled them like a general in the army. After the buses were loaded with the white students, the Rangers lined 64th Street for 3 blocks. Fort was atop a mailbox. As each bus drove by, he held up a long stick and the Rangers roared a deafening Blackstone. It was incredible theater, says the Reverend Tracy O'Sullivan. Well, who would know more about the theater of the absurd than the Reverend of the Catholic Church, but that's another story. He was from the Catholic Church at the corner of 64th and Woodlawn. He decided right on that spot that it would be wrong to attack the school. He was reading the scene beyond the emotion of revenge and saying, how can I use this to further my power? Perhaps, or maybe he just knew he had those people under his control. He had to do something with them or they were going to attack the white students. So why does it have to be furthering his own power? Maybe Jeff Fort was bad, but I don't see this as evidence of it. The guy was a genius. I never had a doubt about him from seeing him in operation.
Dr. King, I understand that you have just reached agreement with Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago. Does that mean that the threat of violence tonight in Chicago is considerably diminished in your estimation?
Well, I certainly hope so, and in a sense I feel that the threat of violence tonight is diminished a great deal as a result of the agreement. I don't want to give the impression...
The period right before the riots, like in Detroit and Chicago, the black neighborhoods actually got more densely populated than even New York City because the cities were still in segregation. But you had all these black population coming in the city, but they could only live in a few neighborhoods. So their neighborhoods, even though they were more run down, their rent was higher because there was more demand and fewer apartments.
This is why we have to get out into the streets. Not in a march, not as a protest, but as men and women who are trying to solve problems.
So that was Woodlawn of Jeff Fort's era. An expensive slum that got filled up with the Children's Army almost overnight. Under Jeff Fort's guidance, the Blackstone Rangers grew from a handful of kids to an estimated 200 members by 65, 1,566, and 3,067. In 68, Ranger President Eugene Bull Hairston went to prison, and Jeff Fort, as second in command, inherited a 5,000-member confederation of street gangs that stretched from 31st Street to South Shore. Fort renamed the gang the Black Peastone Nation. The Rangers spent most of their time fighting their arch rivals, the East Side Disciples, in turf wars that claimed dozens of lives. Fort negotiated many peace treaties, but they never lasted. In late '64, a white minister named John Fry became the pastor of the historic First Presbyterian Church of Chicago at 64th and Kimbark. To quell gang wars, Fry opened his church to the Blackstone Rangers, and soon foundations and not-for-profit organizations like Kettering Foundation, which when I was in graduate school, I administrated grants for them in Detroit many years later. It's gigantic. The Community Renewal Society, Clement Stone, that's another one I worked with, rushed in with grants to help channel the gang's power into positive community action. Charles LaPaglia, who was a youth worker at the church, held leadership training sessions with the Rangers. But LaPaglia says he and Fry would end up learning more from Jeff Fort than they could ever have taught him about leadership. When Jeff Fort was 13, still young enough to maybe be a little bit in a dream state, he tried to take the area around 63rd and Stony Island, which I guess was like a really red light, wino, prostitute area in Chicago, and turn it into the Enchanted City. In Fort's mind, this enchanted city of hobos and bums and prostitutes and poor people would have magical powers, and that the people would organize around the idea and develop rules of interaction, like respecting the little kids. But of course, the Enchanted City idea didn't really play out, and Jeff Fort stopped being 13 and he became a teenager, and the harsh realities of the world came to him, and gang violence continued. Chicago PD raided the First Presbyterian Church and found several guns that the Rangers had turned over to Fry in a gang truce. But the damage was done, and the church was labeled the arsenal for the Blackstone Rangers. There's our old friends, the media, giving fake news, to quote our not-so-great president. In 1967, two radically different solutions to the gang violence problem were advanced. The police created a 10-man gang intelligence unit to break up the gangs, but a fledgling black community group called the Woodlawn organization got almost $1 million in federal grants to start a gang-run job training program that would provide classes to 800 Blackstone Rangers and East Side disciples. Senator Charles Percy had praised Jeff Fort as a bright young man who should enter politics and invited him to Nixon's 1969 inauguration. The $1 million training program had turned into a scandal. It was all in the papers, and money has been embezzled, and et cetera and so forth. And Jeff Fort and 23 Blackstones had been indicted for conspiring to defraud the U.S. government. Montgomery, who was the defense attorney, says that the government's case read like a blueprint for a white right-wing counterattack on the liberalism of the 60s. Destroy one of the last vestiges of the war on poverty and put away a young man who posed a threat to Mayor Daley's reign on Black Chicago, all in one neat, orderly showcase of a trial. The grant program was in trouble from the start. The Mayor Daley of Chicago, if you don't know who he is, he was mayor for like 40 years. He held the most powerful mayor in the United States. He was upset that the feds gave the money directly to the groups and they didn't get any of it, so he undermined it. And Daley knew how gangs operated because he'd been in one himself as a youth, says Kenneth Addison, professor of education at Northeastern Illinois University and an expert on Chicago gangs. Fort had circumvented the Daley machine, as it was known there. He knew the threat that Fort and his followers represented, and so he had the police stay on him and find any little thing and string it all together to make it look bigger than it was.
On December 23rd, 1969, I was indicted for murder. I'm Leonard Sengali, spokesman for the Black Peace Stone Nation. Within the space of a month, the spokesman for the Vice Lords was indicted for murder. The spokesman for the Black Peace Stone Nation was indicted for murder. And the leader of the Illinois Black Panther Party was killed.
The strategy was to harass the gangs at every turn and jail their leaders. The gang intelligence unit repeatedly raided the training centers. Fort was arrested for murder and kept in jail for 5 months. Then the charges got dropped for no reason, because they weren't real. In 1967, the Chicago Tribune, acting on a police tip, started the stories charging the Blackstone Rangers with mismanagement and extortion, which scared off other corporations that would have given more money and the program would have grown. So you see the political system not wanting to see a new power group form. Whatever you think about the power group, maybe they were bad, maybe they were good, but they didn't want to see it happen. When Fort got called as a witness in his trial, he just rose, and this is in front of Congress, not a courtroom, clenched his fist and stalked out of the room. He got cited, not for contempt of court, but contempt of Congress, and later convicted. It took a couple years for him to get charged criminally, but in the end, Jeff Fort was convicted not of any crime of violence or being a gang leader, of fraud, of some money and a bunch of the East Side disciples were key witnesses in the prosecution. When the trial was finally over, Jeff Fort was found guilty of conspiring to misapply federal funds and was sentenced to 5 years in Leavenworth prison. He'd been paid a total of $1.4 million as a center chief, but some of the grant money got turned back in because it wasn't spent. And by one estimate, only about $300,000 even went to the Blackstone Rangers, and all of that wouldn't have went to Fort, but details are quickly forgotten. The idea that Jeff Fort and a Blackstreet gang had ripped off the U.S. government was perfect fodder for right wing to say, you know what, it's time to stop helping the inner city, let whatever happens going to happen. And that's when you saw violent crime in the United States like tripled between 65 and 69. This is the period. So March 12, 76, Jeff Fort gets released from prison to the custody of one of the former youth counselors at his neighborhood church, a man named Chuck LaPaglia, who I quoted above. And he'd become a college professor in Milwaukee. Fort's wife and kids joined him there. Fort tried to enroll in college classes there with LaPaglia, but the Milwaukee police chief was giving him a hard time. And Chuck LaPaglia said Fort became very secretive and made frequent trips to Chicago while he was there. Well, if you had just gotten out of prison for somewhat dubious fraud charges and had many family and friends in Chicago and the chief of police in Milwaukee breathing down your back, you'd probably be secretive too, and you'd probably want to visit Chicago also. And just to backtrack, to give a Cliff's Note reminder of the slightly confusing story of how Fort went to prison in '72. In the mid-'60s, he was the most powerful and charismatic street organization leader in Chicago. Then various outside entities, gigantic white charities, the black church, the federal government itself, gave the Blackstone Rangers and other groups grant money to keep kids out of gangs, which they did to a degree, but some of it was stolen, whatever. But as someone who personally worked at a gigantic urban graduate school, we oversaw all kind of grants. Grant money is made to be misappropriated. It all is. I mean, not all, but a lot. And Jeff Fort didn't, personally get that much. And for that, he was taken out of the Chicago scene just as the last flames of political energy were dying. And when he got out of Leavenworth, which I might add was maybe the toughest or one of the couple toughest penitentiaries in America at the whole time for fraud. So he got sent to the most hardcore pen for a fraud conviction. When he got out and came home to Chicago, that city and most of the rest of the big cities were a lost cause. Much of the South Side was a giant red light district of dope and vice, and this was the landscape he was thrust back into. So it's not surprising to me that perhaps Jeff Fort got a little weird. More in part 2.
But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary.
If you missed part 1 of my Jeff Fort story, Fort was the most powerful gang leader in Chicago during the late 60s while still a teenager, and his power was verging on the political. For example, when Dr. King was killed in Memphis, Chicago started burning. There was an all-white Catholic high school in the Inglewood neighborhood that Fort controlled. Fort had hundreds of his Blackstone Ranger gang members line up outside the school in formation, which intimidated the white students, administrators, and police. But it also protected them from potential attackers in the neighborhood, a strategic move brilliant enough to be in the 48 Laws of Power. But I'm sure Robert Greene doesn't know any Chicago gang history, despite Greene teaming up with 50 Cent for the joint marketing venture of the 50th Law. Fort is housed in Florence ADX with men convicted of thousands of murders, of dozens or hundreds of murders within the prison system itself, yet he's only been convicted of fraud, another probable fraud case, a marijuana conspiracy, and a murder conspiracy where the chief witness seems pretty dubious.
And Kenny Morrow is now working for the government on drug cases against the El Rukns. He became an informant because he believed Jeff Fort and the El Rukns killed his brother and his best friend.
Is there something that sets Jeff Fort apart from the people who led other gangs?
Well, he's a survivor.
Now, technically, the probable fraud case I referenced is his conviction with other Al Rukns in the late 1980s for being the first American citizens convicted of conspiring to perform terrorist acts on behalf of a foreign government.
From federal prison, Jeff Fort oversaw the Libyan operation and determined the Al Rukns needed bigger, better firepower to do the proposed job.
But I think the evidence points to that, them just trying to do a ripoff on federal agents posing as Libyan intelligence officials, but that's another chapter of the story we'll get to another day. So part one of my story on Jeff Fort ended with his release from prison in the mid-70s for misusing some of the nearly $1 million in grant money given to his gang, the Blackstone Rangers, by the federal government in the late 60s. After his release, he went to live in Milwaukee. Charles LaPaglia had been a social worker in the Inglewood area and had worked closely with Fort at the peak of his power in the late 1960s, and they reconnected in Milwaukee, where LaPaglia had also relocated with his family. In fact, Fort was paroled to the custody of Charles LaPaglia.
Former social worker Charles LaPaglia.
I guess the overwhelming impression I have of Jeff Fort was that he was a very intelligent person, very insightful.
Obviously, LaPaglia had a much different view of Jeff Fort than the police, prosecutors, and the media. So it's the late 70s and Jeff Fort is out of prison. He's become Muslim, changed his name to Imam Malik, and is picking up the pieces of the Black Keystone gang he left behind in 1972. Now, I'm not too sure what went on internally with the Peystones with Fort in prison, but by about 1977, a new group of, I assume, but I'm not sure, former Black Peystones has formed something called Al Rukn.
The Al Rukns bill themselves as a Muslim religion devoted to community improvement. Police call them thugs and drug dealers. Gang Crime South Commander Bill Woods.
We're talking heroin, cocaine, PCP, whatever draws a fast buck.
And that's the business of the Al Rukns?
That's the business.
The foundation in Arabic around Imam Malik, aka Jeff Fort. The feds estimated Al Rukn peaked out at less than 250 members, but these were all adults and serious people, not teenage gangbangers. The Navy SEALs of Chicago gangland, if you believe the feds. In fact, the story of Al Rukn and Jeff Fort, which lasts only about 10 years of action on the street, is one of the most disturbing histories I've studied in crime, outside the crimes of the CIA, of course. And the Al Rukns themselves are not even the most disturbing people in the story.
U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas would only give sketchy details about the arrest and the rocket at an afternoon news conference.
Knox was arrested in connection with his attempt to receive an interstate shipment, an M72 light anti-tank weapon for purposes of destroying a building.
In addition to weapons, which appear to be the main priority today, drug paraphernalia, scales, and records of alleged transactions all were part of the search of Al Rukn property.
Al Rukn was tailor-made for the early 80s, the Reagan era, pre-hip-hop, when black faces on the television screen were often used to scare white voters, well, they still are, and Islam was still an exotic unknown. And Jeff Fort himself was perhaps the archetype of the anger and danger of Chicago's black economic underclass.
Who do you have most of the trouble from? Is it white policemen or black policemen? Black policemen.
The media loved Al Rukn.
1976, when Jeff Fort left prison and declared a new religion.
Want to the activity and to shield them from the law.
In the next 9 years, the Al Rukns would set up a fortress-like headquarters on Chicago's South Side with reinforced steel doors and windows. It was called the Fort.
Remember that Jeff Fort was a serious political force while still in his teens in the late 60s, and that not only did he appear in front of Congress, he was invited to Richard Nixon's inauguration in 1972, though he sent Mickey Cogwell in his place.
Will you state your name, please?
Jeff Fort.
Al Rukn's political operations extended to the mayoral campaign. Al Rukn was paid by white Mayor Jane Byrne to campaign and deliver votes on the South Side, and they had ties to Jesse Jackson and his brother Noah Robinson, who ended up being convicted of hiring Al Rukn to kill 2 people for him, and he sits in federal prison for those crimes right now, but yet that's yet another story.
question, what do singer Sammy Davis Jr., Southside businessman Noah Robinson, and the El Rukn street gang have in common? The answer, $1 million redevelopment project at 39th and Drexel. The focal point of the deal was this building. It's called the Fort. Years ago, it was known as the Oakland Theater, but for a long time now, it's been the headquarters of the El Rukn street gang and its now imprisoned leader, Jeff Fort. But this spring, at the same time the El Rukns were, according to police, taking to the streets to shoot uncooperative drug dealers, a new business deal was taking place. A deal to renovate the fort here. A deal that would link the famous with the infamous. The players in this deal, Rico Crenshaw, convicted armed robber and a general in the El Rukns. Maurice Wright, a low-level El Rukn with a minor police record. Noah Robinson, a successful, controversial Southside businessman and half-brother of Jesse Jackson. And last but not least, singer Sammy Davis Jr.
Part 2 of my Jeff Fort story was going to be about Fort and other El Rukns becoming the first American citizens convicted for conspiring to commit terrorist acts in this country on behalf of a foreign government.
U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas.
He was engaged in an attempt to perform terrorist activities against the United States for money.
After watching Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan obtain a $5 million loan from Libya, the El Rukns decided in 1985 there was money to be made in the Muslim world, and so they too reached out to Libya. But what they proposed was the selling of their services. For $2.5 million, they would, in behalf of Muammar Gaddafi, blow up buildings or shoot down airplanes in the United States.
But let's make a detour first, a detour into the corruption of the Illinois criminal justice system and an exploration of how the federal government uses informants that might be worse than the people they're informing against.
Twin early morning assaults, agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, gang crimes officers, plus state police and the FBI all converged on the El Rukn street gang, arresting 3 alleged members.
April 1984, the Ida B. Wells projects on 39th Street on the south side of Chicago. 2 men said to be members of the Goon Squad under the Black Gangster Disciple Nation are shot in the head in broad daylight by masked gunmen. El Rukn are suspected. By 1986, 2 men are convicted for the Goon Squad murders, Earl Hawkins and Nathan Fields. They're both sent to death row for being El Rukn hitmen, and El Rukn itself is destroyed by federal indictments in the coming years. But the story of these 2 particular El Rukns was just getting started. Now, Earl Hawkins, one of the guys convicted, went on to become one of the most legendary informants in Chicago history. A former El Rukn general once described by prosecutors as, quote, a trained killer, a guy who bribed a Cook County judge to fix the double murder case that put him on death row. And his alleged partner in the crime, Nathan Fields, actually just hit the city of Chicago for nearly $30 million for wrongful imprisonment. So how did this dark and twisted reality come into being? Let's go back to '84 and the 2 murdered Goon Squad members outside the Ida B. Wells. Nathan Fields was picked out of a lineup by men who later admitted being members of the BGD Nation, and he went on trial with fellow El Rukn Earl Hawkins. And the judge in the case, Thomas Maloney, was given a $10,000 bribe during the trial to acquit them, and he was going to do just that. But in the middle of the trial, he got the feeling, correctly, that the FBI was onto him. He had been taking bribes in other cases, including other murder cases. The judge ended up convicting them and putting them both on death row. But just a year later, a county prosecutor negotiated a deal with Earl Hawkins, and he was removed from death row in exchange for testifying against other gang members in El Rukn cases and other cases. And 3 years after that, Judge Maloney's corruption finally came out, mainly because of Earl Hawkins, and he was convicted of federal charges that, among other things, he accepted a $10,000 bribe from a corrupt lawyer named William Swano, who represented Earl Hawkins to acquit his client in the 2 Black Gangster Disciple Goon Squad murders. He was also convicted of fixing other murder cases. Now, judges taking bribes in high-profile or very serious cases is less rare than even I thought before I got into my profession here of studying crime, and it's pretty disturbing. Judges are people that we don't know a lot about but have a lot of power. Now, in the light of Judge Maloney's convictions for corruption, a new trial was ordered for Nathan Fields in '96. And while the retrial was pending, two of the key witnesses in that case recanted. A guy named Gerald Morris and Randy Langston had testified at the '86 trial they'd seen Fields and Hawkins gun down the two guys outside the Ida B. Wells. But the guys were wearing ski masks, and in affidavits provided to defense investigators, Morris and Langston stated that police and prosecutors had coached them to falsely identify Fields and Hawkins. Remember, Hawkins didn't have to go on trial again because he was already off death row because he was already working with the people. And in fact, those two witnesses had no idea who the killers were because, like I said, they were wearing ski masks. And according to trial testimony, a detective named O'Callahan coached the witnesses to point out Fields in lineups as the man they saw running from the scene. And during a retrial, Earl Hawkins, Nathan Fields' supposed co-killer, the one let off death row, he got up and testified and said Fields was the one who did it. And as part of his cooperation, he admitted to involvement in at least 15 murders for the Al Rukn. And the judge in that case, or the judge in the retrial, found Hawkins unworthy of belief, given, all the things he confessed to and who he was, and he acquitted Fields on April 8th of 2009. So Fields got out about 12 years ago. And the judge said, if Hawkins has such disregard for human life, what regard will he have for his oath of truth? So once Fields got out, the quest for a lawsuit began. Meanwhile, Hawkins kept testifying against Nathan Fields, but this time it was in the civil lawsuits against the city of Chicago. The city knew a lot of money was at stake, and just like they used Hawkins to put lots of people in prison, they tried to use him to save the millions of dollars Fields had coming. But in the end, Fields filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of Chicago, and in December of 2016, a jury awarded him $22 million. And in January of 2018, a federal judge ordered the city to pay an additional $5.5 million in legal fees, so almost $30 million. Now, the prosecutor in the case, a guy named William Hogan, who was Hawkins' longtime witness protection handler, he kind of built his career on the cases that Hawkins helped him build, recently told the Parole Commission back in 2014 that former Al Rukn General Earl Hawkins had testified in a total of 12 different federal racketeering trials between 91 and 96, leading to the conviction of 55 Al Rukn members and the judge, the corrupt Judge Maloney, who got 15 years in federal prison himself. But even more importantly, apparently for Earl Hawkins than the murders and drug dealing he snitched on, he'd cut a deal with the Illinois criminal justice system. Help us avoid paying Nathan Fields and get out early. And Fields' case took so long to play out. Remember, he got out in 2009. He didn't get a judgment until 2018. That Hawkins actually got out in the middle of it all. In 2014, 4 years before Fields finally defeated the city of Chicago.
Target 1, the fort, the El Rukn headquarters for a dozen years at 39th and Drexel. The ATF, along with other federal, city, and state law enforcement agents, hammered and cut and sawed their way into the fortified old building, which was once the Oakland Theater. The second target today, an apartment building at 6416 South Kenwood, believed to be one of the El Rukn's numerous property holdings. Arrested were 35-year-old Alan Knox, otherwise known as Gangster, a reputed El Rukn general, and Trammell Davis, an alleged general often used as a look-alike for imprisoned El Rukn leader Jeff Fort.
Former hitman who testified that he killed as many as 20 people was quietly freed from prison to start a new life in the federal witness protection program nearly 7 years ago. His release came despite earlier public assurances from prosecutors that Hawkins was nowhere near release, and Hawkins' own testimony during the civil suit where they were trying to prove, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but just 51% or more that Nathan Fields was indeed the killer in the case. Hawkins said he didn't expect to get out, but he got out right after he testified. And Candace Gorman, who was Fields' attorney, said revealed the 2 prosecutors and 2 former Chicago cops, 3 of whom were key to all the Al Rukn investigations, wrote letters of support for Hawkins in his bid to win release from his federal racketeering sentence, because he already wasn't serving time for the Illinois murders. While the terrorism case against Jeff Fort and Al Rukn and various other cases after that were very high-profile successes in the war on crime in Chicago, but not surprisingly, given the nature of the informants and prosecution witnesses, many of those convictions were reversed after it came out that a lot of the guys cooperating, chiefly Earl Hawkins, not only were getting out early and getting off death row, they were getting perks while they even did the time they did do. They were given drugs, new clothes, and witness protection. You can pretty much wear what you want. They were having sex and witness protection. So they were living, like they were on the outs. So really they got out of prison a long time ago. Federal prosecutor William Hogan was fired in '96 amid an FBI probe into allegations he had concealed drug use in jail by 2 of his star witnesses, but that decision was reversed 2 years later by an administrative judge. Hogan was ordered reinstated and remains an assistant U.S. attorney. Illinois Circuit Judge Thomas Maloney, who presided over Nathan Fields and Earl Hawkins' bench trial that sent him to death row back in the late 80s, was himself later convicted of pocketing $10,000 to fix the case. Like I said, he got 15 years in federal prison. And then there was the federal jury that found Detective O'Callahan liable for violating Nathan Fields' due process rights for a fair trial during the original investigation into the double murder. According to testimony in that trial, O'Callahan coached witnesses to point out Nathan Fields in lineups as the man they saw running from the scene, even though the gunman wore ski masks. Now, setting up for part 3, O'Callahan was partners with a detective named Brannigan, who actually went to high school in Jeff Fort's neighborhood. He went to that high school where, after the King assassination, the Blackstone Rangers lined up. And according to him, he had to fight off Fort's racially motivated gang attacks all the way back in the 60s.
Jeff Fort told me one time several years ago, I think it was about 1981 or 81, when he told me that Brannigan and I would never put him in prison. And I said, Jeff, just wait, it's coming.
Brannigan and his partner, a guy named Kolovitz, had vowed to get Jeff Fort personally all the way back in the late 70s or 1980, and the repercussions of that promise helped cause the city of Chicago to pay out nearly $30 million in the Nathan Fields case alone. And this is the problem with depending on informants, turncoats, and police with personal vendettas to fight the war on crime. Now, I hate to use the word ironic for such serious and dark matters, but I guess all I can say is think of the irony of Nathan Fields getting $30 million in a lump sum from the city of Chicago because they try to frame him up as part of getting the Al Rukns. And I'm sure that the Al Rukn itself, during the whole 10 years it existed, didn't generate $30 million in profits. It was a lot of money, especially back in the early 80s. Let that sink in. So, more on Al Rukn and corruption in Chicago coming soon. American Dope.
Charles LaPaglia, who worked with Fort at the First Presbyterian Church, now runs a West Coast jazz club.
I see him as one of the people, one of the kinds of bright, talented people in the underclass who tried to do something about his situation and was crushed.